Chers amis, cher ami, I wanted to introduce you. I will use Bahasa Inggris karena saya lebih lancar di dalam Bahasa Inggris ini. Pertama, nanti saya tahu nanti Daniel akan juga pakai Bahasa Inggris. Dia lebih lancar daripada saya di dalam Bahasa Indonesia, tetapi buat semua bisa mengerti. Je suis vraiment très heureux. I am very, very happy because tonight is like to get back to a golden age, to a kind of golden age for us, to an age where you study, and when you study, you of course meet friends, people who have the same passion as you have, who share the same willingness to achieve something. Something that is not maybe really clear in his mind, but we all share the idea that yes, we can do something special. Daniel, at this time, was studying. He had already a career of a kind. He was an accountant at this time. It was long, long, long ago. I was a little bit younger, so I was just a student. And we were studying with the same teachers, experts in Indonesia, on Indonesia. But we were not very, we had a small knowledge about Indonesia at this time. Daniel had some trip, quite long trips, but for leisure in Indonesia, especially. From myself, I didn't have any experience of Indonesia at this very moment. And we had studying hard, and we share the same director, the same mentor, the same guru, Professor Denis Lombard, that you probably all know. We share some others, Claude Guillot, Henri Chamberlois, Marcel Bonnef, all of generation of quite experienced academics with an extended knowledge of Indonesia, including Professor Labrousse, Anibo Farida Sumargono, Christian Pelleras, Dugas, an anthropologist. We had a good group of Indonesian specialists of an academy. And it was a time where Lusa Jawa Senang Budaya, Le Carrefour Javanais, was just published, or nearly published. It was in 91, or 92. But Professor Lombard was then not professor yet, exactly. He was just preparing his master thesis. And I remember very well one of those days. We were with Daniel, along with Daniel and with Frédéric Durand, another academic, with a geographer. And we were all three of us. And we asked Professor Denis Lombard, what do we have to do? And since this day he told us, archaeology. Archaeology is the way. Because we have plenty of historians, but we lack of archaeologists. And so, for Daniel, it was really ringing a bell. It was really, for him, very suitable. He was the only one who was the obedient, but because it was so in his DNA. And nowadays, today, after 30 years exactly, because we were in 1989, after 30 years exactly, he is here, right now, in front of you, with 90 years of French-Indonesian archaeological studies, archaeological cooperation in North Sumatra. And I want to include this in the scope of Daniel because he has moved from Malaysia to Sumatra, from Malaysia to Indonesia, from Indonesia to Sumatra, having headed the École Française d'Extrême-Orient in both countries, from one to the others, having led researches in both countries. What does it mean? Not that he doesn't know which country is the most interesting, but because it was, of course, for the period he is studying, the same continuum and the same story. And so he had to complete his research from part of the from one side of the border to the other side of the border. So, as you have understood, it's a bit emotional for me to introduce Daniel after all those years, those 30 years of friendship, plus those 90 years of French archaeological research. So I am quite ecstatic to see Daniel leading us to this field trip, not only in geography or in a space or in a place, but a field trip in time. We are in a time machine as well, 90 years. So thank you very much, and I hope you will enjoy it as much as I will enjoy it for sure.
Thank you, Stéphane. Yeah. Today I will give a talk about a field which is rather unusual in Indonesia, which is the archaeology of settlement. It is a field which started about 50 years ago in Indonesia, and it started slowly, and still now it remains a field not as developed as it should be. But as Stéphane mentioned just now, I was when I was doing my PhD in France, I had the opportunity to come to Indonesia in '90 to follow excavation with Claude Guillot, and it was in Banten, and I took the opportunity to do this research on a settlement in the suburbs of Banten, which was in Banten-Gerang, and from this time, so from 1990 until now, I continued to work on settlement. Why this field is not well developed in Indonesia? I think it's related to activities of archaeology in the colonial period. The Dutch archaeologists were very much focused on temples, on inscription, and on art, so all kinds of bas-relief and statues, but they almost completely neglected the settlement, the way of life of the people outside of the religious sphere. I remember only maybe a survey and limited excavation in Troubulan in Java, and also one scholar, also the Flines, who did a survey in Java to collect Chinese ceramics, which became the ceramic collection of the National Museum today. But apart from this, there was almost nothing on settlement. So today I will present this field in the framework of our cooperation with the National Center for Archaeological Research of Indonesia, for which my institution, EFAO, has long cooperation. It started with Louis Dalmé after the Second World War, and we have an agreement of cooperation since 1976. So my activity is just one part of this long cooperation between our two institutions. And I will try to present very briefly, because the talk is rather short, three sites of North Sumatra where I had the opportunity to conduct research with my colleague from the Pusat Arkenas, Papa Heddy Surachman. And when I did my PhD at the AS with Denis Lombard, I did my PhD already on North Sumatra. So I have been working on this area for 30 years. And when I did my PhD, I never expected to be able to do this archaeological project all the way from 95 until now on the major settlement site of North Sumatra. So I would like to share with you some results of this research, and also to show you what does that mean to do research on ancient settlement in Indonesia, and what kind of context do we face when we work on this kind of archaeological site. And I think it is interesting because through these three sites you will see a quite different context to conduct research. But first of all, before to start this talk, I would like to thank IFI and the FAO Center in Jakarta for inviting me to present this talk. So, in fact, the title is 19 years of cooperation, but the French-Indonesian cooperation in North Sumatra started much earlier, in fact in 95, with a project conducted by Claude Guillot. So I had the opportunity to be part also of this project since 95 until the end of this project in 2000. And after that, in 2001, with my colleague Heddy Surachman, we started our own project on the west coast of Sumatra. And after that, we moved to the center of the island in Padang Lawas, and we just finished a project on the Strait of Malaka at Kota Cina. So you may ask why French historian, archaeologists want to go to the west coast of North Sumatra. At that time, in 95, it was still difficult to reach this region. The reason is that on the west coast of North Sumatra there is a place named Barus, which has been known in foreign sources at least since the second half of the first millennium, for particularly one product, which is camphor. In Indonesian it's called the kapur Barus. It's not the modern kapur Barus, because the modern kapur Barus is naphthalene, so nothing to do with the real camphor, which is a product of the camphor tree. So Barus was well known since at least the second half of the first millennium because of camphor. And to mention just an author, Marco Polo, at the end of the 13th century, he mentioned that at the time camphor was as expensive as gold. So you can imagine the attraction of Barus, because at that time Barus produced the best camphor in the world. This is the reputation at the time. So you can imagine the attraction of this place, especially for traders coming from several parts in the Indian Ocean. So this is one point. The other point was gold. Sumatra has for a long time been known for its wealth in gold, and Barus was a place where gold was available for a long time. We have also benzoin, medicinal plants. I think about 250 species were available as a medicinal plant in the Barus area, and other forest products, which as mentioned here: logs, scented wood, resin, dyewoods, lacquer wood, ivory, elephants, beeswax, honey. Also civet and musk, silk, indigo, shrimpas, ambergris, semi-precious stones. So, after the completion of the first project which was devoted to a site of Lobutua, known since the 19th century, because at that time people found an inscription. It's a very special inscription because it's written in Tamil, and it's dated to the end of the 11th century. And this inscription attracted the attention of several scholars since the 19th century, and in the 17th and 80s, so before the start of our program, we had several studies and also the first survey conducted by colleagues from the Pustit Arkanas in the Barus area, and also people working on Malay text produced in Barus. For example, Jen Drucker, an Australian scholar, did research on Malay text in Barus, text written in the 19th century, but with historical information on the past of Barus. And it was also a time where a famous mystic poet was also studied, the Amsa Fansuri. So we had a conjunction of preliminary studies which for us was a very big attraction to try to get some new insight on the past of Barus. So we, after the completion of the project in Lobutua, a site which has been dated between the 9th century and the end of the 11th century or beginning of the 12th century, we started a new project on a very close site, also in the Barus area, which is called Bukit Hasang. So this project was conducted between 2001 and 2005. I will mention the main objective of this project, and in fact the main objective will be the same for the three sites I will present today. First, a question of space, how to determine the topographical boundaries and morphology of the ancient settlement site of the in the Barus region, chronology of the occupation following this abandonment of this Lobutua site, which is about 5 kilometers away from Barus in a straight line. The idea also was to produce a catalogue of archaeological finds as complete as possible to become a reference for Southeast Asia contemporary site. So this is a very important part of our research. In all the projects we have conducted since 95, but especially since 2001 with Heddy Surachman, is to the idea was to produce something which would be useful for other sites, not only in Indonesia but also for Southeast Asia. Also, logically, to identify the reason for the foundation of the site, origin of the people living there and their way of life, to clarify Barus' place in regional history, and to highlight the relation between Barus and the Indian Ocean, because Barus is on the coast of the Indian Ocean, particularly South Asia, Middle East and the Near East, because you will see that by doing research on places like Barus, we face artifacts coming from all over Asia, from the eastern part of Mediterranean region to China. In Barus, we had the advantage to combine several kinds of data. First, archaeological data coming directly from our research, but also local epigraphic sources. I will discuss a bit about this, mostly on Islamic tombstone, local literature and tradition, Barus in the 19th century was a real center for Malay literature, and Barus produced several texts which were very important for us to compare with our archaeological data. And I can say now that it is interesting to notice that a few facts mentioned in this text were confirmed by our archaeological excavation. So this is something interesting. Usually Malay literature is not well considered for historical research because there is almost no chronology, but when we look at the way they present the history and our archaeological data, we were able to match some events. And as I mentioned earlier, foreign return sources, so sources coming from the Middle East, especially Arabic sources, also Persian sources, also sources from Egypt, especially from the Jewish settlement, the Geniza in Cairo, and also local Indonesian sources like Hikayat Sejarah Melayu or Hikayat Raja Baseh. Everybody knows about these Malay sources. To do this research, we need money, so we had financial support from various parties, especially IFEO, so my institution, French School of Asian Studies, French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is something I think rather unique still now in the world, that Ministry of Foreign Affairs support, I think it's about 200 projects every year, project conducted in cooperation between French archaeologists and local archaeologists, and of course French embassy in Indonesia. For this Bukit Hasang project, we had also the logistic support of the National Center for Archaeological Research. Important support because we, after the second or third year of research, we had a house to store our finds and to work there for the documentation and also for restoration and other activities. So you can see here what is the settlement site in Sumatra and let's say more generally in tropical areas. We are in a context completely different from a settlement site in the Middle East, especially where you have small hills, sometimes 20 meters high, where there is an accumulation of buildings and everything. Here, in this kind of site, there is, let's say, almost no accumulation. We walk into the village. You can see the village of Bukit Hasang here, and the village is on the site. So you can see, if we walk in this village, we can find a shard, ceramic shards, pottery shard, dating from the 13th or 14th century quite easily. So you can see here the proof of this. From the present ground surface, we are directly on the settlement site, which this site is dated from the 12th until the 16th century. So you can imagine that with such site located in the middle of villages, with people doing all kinds of agricultural activities, it's not an easy task to do excavation there. So another problem which we faced in almost all our projects, the land is privately owned. So for every excavation, we need the agreement from the landowner and sometimes it's difficult because there is the plot of land is small, but there are 4, 5, or 6 owners, so this is one problem. The other problem, if there is a plantation, if there are fruit trees, if there is a durian tree, for example, we can do nothing. Otherwise, all the money for the excavation will be given to fell down the tree. So we had to be very careful. We couldn't conduct a systematic excavation. We had to find free land to do our excavation. And this is the problem we face in all this settlement site. So how to do this excavation? So we work with local villager, and yeah, we train them a bit, and we work together. So we don't let them to do the excavation alone. Just to give you an idea, at the peak of the project, we had about 100 people on the ground every day, and we also faced some obligation also to rotate the people every 3 days. So every 3 days we had to welcome about half of the workers. So you can imagine the organization needed to do all these things, but we managed to do it. And I remember I have calculated the number of workers we had on our project during the 5 years of the project. It was about 1,000 people from this Barus area. So you can imagine that this project, in fact, was the largest undertaking in the Kecamatan of Barus, and even the Chamat was eager to join the excavation. So we work with the local people, and all the steps we can do on the field. So not only excavation, but also sieving and cleaning, and also labeling. So after the excavation conducted between 2001 and 2004, we were able to excavate more than 100 trenches, representing about 500 square meters. I cannot go into the details of the excavation. I would just like to mention what kind of finds we have in such site, and in fact the general category will be the same for the three, almost the same for the three sites I will present. As usual, the largest category is earthenware or pottery. So you can see here we had a rather large assemblage of pottery, almost 140,000 shards, weighing more than a ton. A specific kind of pottery, which we call the glazed earthenware. You will see some example later. It is something very unusual, but it's a very nice production, coming mostly from the Middle East, from Iran, but also could be coming from Syria or Egypt. But there are also examples of pottery from India. I will show you later. Stoneware and porcelain. So this is a well-known category with assemblage exceeding 41,000 shards, which is a rather large corpus also. Glassware. This is an interesting type of finds. It's typical of the settlement site, let's say from the northern half of Sumatra, also from peninsular Malaysia and the southern part of Thailand. We have shards of glassware. You will see some example later. but it is something which is rather unusual in the southern half of Sumatra and almost absent in Java, for example. Glass bead, a few glass bead, 200, so it was not Bukit Hasang was not a rich site for beads. Bracelet, so iron object, or most of the time fragment of iron object, bronze, gold, lead, silver, Chinese coins, a few Chinese coins, stone beads, and container made of stone. I don't think there will be some example here, but interesting, very few, but this container come from the Middle East, probably from Yemen, because it is made in a specific type of stone, which is a chlorite, and we are rather confident that this kind of container was made in the Arabic Peninsula. So I cannot go into the detail and describe all the find, but what I want to show is that we try to use one category of finds, which is stoneware and porcelain, which are rather well dated, because this kind of finds has a history of research starting from the beginning of the 20th century, mostly on Chinese ceramics, but also Southeast Asian ceramics. So as this kind of find is rather well dated, as we had more than 40,000 shards, we try to look at the distribution of this find on the site according to the chronology. And you can see that the result is rather satisfying. We can follow the evolution, the spatial evolution of the site from the 12th century until the early 16th century. So you can see during the 12th century the site was just founded, and it was occupied on about 3 hectares, and it evolves from the 13th to the 14th. We've also sometimes we could read some probably some crises, some change in the history of the site through the distribution of the ceramic shard. And the space was the largest occupation was between the 15th century and the early 16th century, with a site with a surface area of about 65 hectares. So this is, I think it was probably the first time in Indonesia that this use of stoneware and porcelain was studied to look at the evolution of the site. So it is one way to look at the history of Barus. Here on the left, I just show what is probably the most common ceramic in Bukit Hasang. This is a 14th century ceramic coming from China. So to give you a few examples of interesting find, when we completed our excavation, I need to mention first that when you think about archaeology, you think about digging, but in fact digging is only a small part of the research. We spend about 5 weeks a year digging, and the rest of the year is work of documentation and preparation of publication. So digging is sometimes it's complicated, but for me the most complicated part is to make sense of all this find, because when you do an excavation, it's like opening a library. It's like yeah, you have this thousands and thousands of artifacts which need to be analyzed, and with my colleague Heddy Surachman, we emphasized the activity of restoration, and this activity of restoration takes a long time. You can see here an example on the top. We have pottery. You can see there are a number of shards, but the result is very interesting because we get the whole shape of the container. So after the completion of the excavation, it was 2007, 2008, I decided to go to India to bring my drawings, my picture of all this pottery to show to Indian colleagues. So I toured India from Calcutta to Chennai, to Maharashtra, to Gujarat, and meet my colleague in India and show them the picture and ask them, okay, do you know this type of pottery? Do you know this decoration? And the result was fantastic because we, at the end of this trip, it was sure that Barus was related to almost the whole coast of India at the time. And it is only through this trip to India where I brought the document to show to my colleagues that we became convinced of this fact. One example, for this one on the top, so on the left you have the Bukit Hasang find in Barus. So I went to Gujarat and I went to a place called Kambe, which was a very well-known port at the time of Bukit Hasang. And I went to the market, and pottery are still for sale there, and I found a pottery with exactly the same shape as the one we found in Barus, still used today. If I remember, it was used for ghee, so for Indian butter. So this is a kind of result which show the necessity to spend time on the restoration of artifact, because if we didn't do this work of restoration, we had only maybe a rim shard, so only small part of the container, which were not very informative on the whole shape. But with the whole shape, we can compare with the Gujarat shape, and we can say that it's exactly the same shape. So the idea is that this container was probably brought by people from Gujarat, or at least if it was made locally, but I don't think so. People who are very much inspired by this kind of containers. Another example, also in the same area in Gujarat, I was brought to a site recently discovered at the time, a site named Laskar Shah, a few kilometers away from Kambe, where Indian archaeologists had just found a place where glazed earthenware was produced. So you can see this glazed earthenware. So you can see here a proof of production, because we have bowls stuck together with some pieces to separate them during the firing. So it is clear that glazed earthenware was produced there at the time. And in Barus, we had very similar shards. This one kind of blue-green shard. So it is, we didn't do any analysis at the time, any fabric analysis to be sure, because at the time the site was just known by the archaeologists. They were just starting to work on it, so it was not possible to do that. But there is a strong probability that these two shards are coming from a plate or bowl were produced in Gujarat also. And other, maybe even more spectacular result, we found this small statuette in Bukit Hasang. At first, we didn't pay much attention to this piece, which is wow, a piece which is made of terracotta, so very basic production. But after cleaning, we discovered that there is a shape, and it's a figurine. And when I look at the publication of people working in the Indian Ocean, I found that in Bahrain, colleagues have found almost exactly the same statuette on the settlement site, also dated 12th, 14th century, so exactly contemporary to Bukit Hasang. And they found this figurine in a place, in the part of the site they identified as the Indian Quarter. So, yes, it was rather satisfying to find that for this small statuette, small figurine, which is not a masterpiece, we had some idea of production. So this is probably related to the presence of Indian traders in Bukit Hasang. And on the left side, I'll show you a few examples of glassware found in Bukit Hasang. So with various colors, various shapes, and various kind of decoration. So this is quite special for the northern half of Sumatra to have such nice finds of glassware. Apart from excavation, we were also able to document a number of gravestones in the Barus area. In fact, Barus was known since the 80s through a survey conducted by colleagues from Pusat Penelitian about the wealth of the Barus area on all the tombstone, Islamic tombstone. So our idea was to document all these tombstones, to do a typology of the shapes, and also to read all the inscription, or try to read all the inscription which were still readable. And we had a very interesting result. So for the typology, we were able to follow the evolution of this funerary Islamic art from the middle of the 14th century until the beginning of the 19th century. So we documented 300 gravestones. So this is for typology. So you can see here all the different shapes. Some of the shapes are unique, are really original product from Barus. Others are combination of gravestone produced in other areas, especially in Aceh, the northern tip of Sumatra, with local shapes. So this was one part of the study. The other part of the study was the epigraphical study. So the reading of the inscription itself. I show you two examples. On the top, this one, a very small, a small gravestone, but very interesting, because there is a combination of Arabic language with Persian influences, a Malay word, and also a name which could be a Chinese name, and there is a date, so 1370. And my conclusion that this gravestone may belong to a Chinese Muslim community coming from Bengal. So you have the English translation on the right. So this one was quite readable. My colleague Ludwig Kalus from Sorbonne University was able to read almost the whole thing, but you can see only through one inscription we have an idea of the cosmopolitanism of Barus, the pottery, all these finds. They show the variety, the diversity of people living in Barus at the time. Here, here you can another inscription. This one was found during our excavation, but during a survey close to our excavation. And at first glance, so we have an inscription incised, not very well done. But after reading, we had a date which is 1350. This inscription is one of the oldest Islamic inscription, dated Islamic inscription in Southeast Asia. If I remember, it's number 6 in Southeast Asia on the chronology so far. The oldest one is in Brunei, but this one is number 6. So sometimes we have such find which doesn't look very interesting, but after studying, it's an exceptional piece. And you can see the shape. This is the shape of the gravestone. It was a unique example in Barus. We had only this gravestone, but the oldest in Barus, and also one of the oldest in Southeast Asia. So at the end of the project, we were able to produce a book, a collective volume, because as I will explain again later, archaeology is a multidisciplinary field, so we had a lot of cooperation with a number of colleagues. So we published volumes on this research in French in Paris in 2009, but I decided to translate this volume, so it was published in Indonesian in 2015. For me, it's very important that the Indonesian public has access to the result of our research. So I think the book was very well received. Now we move to the middle of North Sumatra. After the completion of our research in 2005 with my colleague Heddy Surachman again, we decided to move to this area. Why? This area is called Padang Lawas. It is located south of the Toba Lake. Just to summarize the area, it's in the middle of nowhere. We are very far from Medan. It's about 12 hours. Pekanbaru is probably something like 7 hours. Padang also. So we are in the middle of nowhere. But this area is very interesting archaeologically. It has been known since the middle of the 19th century, when explorers discovered Indo-Buddhist remains in this area. And since that time, people have been interested in studying mostly temples, but also statues. I will show some examples later. Overall, so there are about 32 or 33 sites on the upper reaches of a river named Barumun River. So you can see this Barumun River, which, the Padang Lawas area is located on the east side of the Barisan Range, and it's the Barumun River basin flow down to the Strait of Malacca. So this Padang Lawas area was known since the middle of the 19th century. Not much extensive research had been done there after, except a bit in the 30s, but again focused on a few temples. And at the time we were doing our research in Barus, colleagues from the archaeological office in Medan started to survey and also do some limited excavation in one site, which is the site number 11, somewhere here, site number 11, which is the Sipamutung, and they got very interesting result because first they did the mapping of the site, which revealed the existence of earthworks, and also through their test pit they found also earthenware, ceramics, and so all indication of settlements. In fact, until that time, scholars agreed that this area was a remote area and where some kind of secret Hindu-Buddhist ritual were conducted. Nobody was living there except monks and strange people. So with my colleague Heddy, we were a bit suspicious about this idea. If there were temples, there must be people somewhere. So with our experience in Barus, I started in '95 until, so I spent 11 seasons in Barus, so we had already a pretty good experience on settlements in this area. So the challenge was to find the settlement related to the Hindu-Buddhist remains of this Sipamutung site. So here you have an idea of the location of the site, so quite different from Barus. This area, so between the rivers, almost empty. There are two small villages, but not much street on the site. And what is, I will show you later, but what is important here is that part of the site is already protected, it's already gazetted. So it's not the same situation as in Barus, where the settlement is under the present village. So, just to summarize this Padang Lawas area, we have about 16 sites with more or less documented remains of brick or stone monuments. 4 temples complex have been restored by the Office for Conservation since the 70s, and in fact this Sipamutung complex, you can see here, was just completed when we started our excavation in 2006, and it took 10 years for a team of about 10 people. I don't think they worked the whole year there, but it took 10 years to restore this complex. So when we entered the site, we had this religious complex almost at the center. Apart from temple complex, there is also a very large assemblage of statue and different kinds of images. So I managed to document about 250 remains, mostly sculptures in tufa, which is a common stone in the area, and it is easy to work. Apart from this, there is also an epigraphic corpus comprising 11 inscriptions on stone or metal. The languages are mostly Old Malay, but also Sanskrit and Tamil, and the date are between the 11th and 13th century. So we are here on the site, this area, contemporary to Barus on the west coast we have just left. So we conducted our excavation from 2006 until 2009. We managed to excavate a larger surface area compared to Barus, here more than 1,000 square meters. And it's a large site, about 75 hectares. What is special in this site? That we have earthen wall and a rather complex system of earthen walls. You can see here, dividing the site in several, let's say, quarters. Yeah? You can see one quarter here, one here, 6 or 7 quarters. So this is rather strange to have this kind of compartmentation of the site, and it was a bit, yeah, a lot of question about this system for us at the beginning of the excavation, and in fact we had a surprise at the very beginning of the excavation. In Barus, we also found earthen walls, but they were defensive walls, and inside the moat we found a lot of artifacts. We were thinking, okay, in Sipamutung we have also these earthen walls, let's dig this moat and we will get a general idea of the find in Sipamutung. But unfortunately, this moat revealed empty, almost nothing inside. So we spent about 2 weeks, the whole team digging a long trench in this large moat, but with a negative result. So you can see something also different from Barus. The site is not visible on the ground surface, except the temple remains, but the old anthropic level are about 25 centimeters below the present surface. So if we walk on the site, we see nothing. So how to do our excavation? We have in front of us 75 hectares. We have only 5 weeks. What to do? So we did very pedestrian surveys in all the area. We had also the excavation done by colleagues a few years before, and in fact we were fortunate to find some traces, indication of settlements outside the earthen walls. And in fact, something which was rather surprising for us, the main settlement of the site was outside the earthen walls, the area here. We are here. This was the dominant part of the site was outside. So at the end of this program, we were able to date the site because we got also a lot of artifacts, mid-9th century until the end of the 13th century. So a site contemporary to both Barus site, Lobutua, and Bukit Hasang. So you can see examples of excavation. What did we find there? Traces of settlement were noticeable through layers of pebbles and gravel. You can see here example of a layer of pebbles and gravel where we could find artifact in a flat position, which means undisturbed, and we interpreted this as a, let's say, a floor. And I remember in one area we had 14 floors successive in one area. So the problem is that, as you see, it's not a compact floor. So you have shards going down from the top. So it's not ideal for the dating, but it was rather satisfying to have this reading of the excavation to find this this layer of pebbles and gravel. We found also the lower part of brick remains, also something also usual in this kind of site, pits of sometimes also fireplaces or places where people were throwing waste, or different kind of pits. But this kind of pits are usually rich in artifacts. We found also post holes, so you can see before excavation here you can see dots, dark dots, which revealed some holes. So most of them post hole, maybe not all of them. So theoretically, you can use this post hole to reconstruct the houses, but you can imagine that during the four centuries of occupation, there are several houses have been built there, and we would have to open a much larger area to try to find the ground plan of the house. But at least we had the proof of houses using a post in Sipamutung. Regarding the finds, so again, we have a lot of earthenware, so you can see almost 172,000 stoneware and porcelain. Don't forget that we are in the middle of Sumatra, between the 9th and the 13th century, so to have 23,000 shards of stoneware and porcelain, for us it was rather surprising to have a site so rich in artifacts. Glass containers, 4,000, again a very strong assemblage of glassware. Glass beads, bracelets, iron, bronze, gold, lead, coins, 3 coins. I will show you an example. And again, stone containers. What the most surprising, in Sipamutung, so we tested the same idea as in Barus regarding the spatial evolution of the site. We looked at the distribution of the stoneware and porcelain, but this time we tried a bit more sophisticated method by looking at the density of shards by cubic meter excavated. So it's a more exact, more precise method than the one we used in Barus. So we were able to look at the evolution of the site from century to century, so from the 9th until the end of the 13th century. And I just show you one example. You can see here that the northern part of the site, so outside the part of the site with the earthen wall, is the densiest occupied part of the site. The most unexpected find in Sipamutung was this coin. This coin is in fact a dirham from Bukhara, so Central Asia, present Uzbekistan. My colleague Ludwig Kalus was able to read the inscription on the coin, and he identified the dynasty which issued the coin, and there was a date, so very beginning of the 11th century, and you have the name of the issuer of the coin. So it's not expected to have this coin coming from Central Asia, to find this in the middle of Sumatra. While for the history of the site, it's not much, but yeah, it's a kind of spectacular find on such a settlement site. Again, at the end of the program, we were able to produce two books in Paris. These books are written in English, and again with a lot of collaboration from a number of colleagues of various institutions in the world. First volume devoted to the archaeological study, excavation and catalogue of the find. So again, with the idea that this kind of publication will become a reference for contemporary sites, not only in Indonesia, but also in Southeast Asia. And a second volume, which is a more synthetic volume with colleagues contributing on history of art, also on epigraphy and various other topics, to combine all these fields to try to bring a new understanding about this history of Padang Lawas, which before the excavation was still in the dark, except the idea that strange people were doing strange things in the temple there. Yeah, that's all. Yeah. So these books are still available, and if you're interested, you can contact Archipel. I would like to mention also this project in Sipamutung was in fact the first time that a settlement site was excavated on a relatively extensive scale in the northern half of Sumatra, just to give you an idea of the state of knowledge about settlements in Sumatra. Now we move to the last site I will present today, which is Kota Cina. So we are in the suburbs of Medan, on the Strait of Malacca. Again, very different context. So you remember Sipamutung in the countryside between two rivers, almost no occupation, no modern occupation. We are here in Kota Cina, and the site is here. So it's a now semi-urbanized area, so quite different context compared to Sipamutung and even to Barus. We are very close to a mangrove area. The coast is a few kilometers away, and so from Kota Cina it's possible to reach the coast through a number of channels through the mangrove. You can see a picture of the mangrove here. So again, very different context compared to the previous sites. This project, like the previous one, is multidisciplinary research. You have here the name of the institution, not all of them, several institutions collaborating for this Kota Cina project. I will show you the idea, in fact, with each new project is try to innovate, to bring a new field, if there is a potential, try to have a new focus, try to make the most of the potential of the site. So I will show you a few examples for this Kota Cina site. This Kota Cina site was in fact rediscovered in the 70s by Edward McKinnon, and in fact this work in Kota Cina in the 70s opened the period of archaeological research on settlement in Indonesia. So we are back to the beginning of the research on old settlement. I mean historical settlement, not prehistorical. Historical settlement, I can say the research in Indonesia started here in Kota Cina in the 70s. So I cannot go into the detail of the rediscovery of the site, but after the completion of our research in Sipamutung, again with the insight of the experience since our work in Barus, we decided to come to Kota Cina. We knew already that the site was very much destroyed because of the urbanization, but we were thinking, okay, we will try to see if there is something to do. So the first 2 years was a kind of testing, a preliminary excavation to see if there was still something to do or not. just to give you an example, we faced a problem we didn't face in Sipamutung or in Barus, urbanization of the site. In 2013, we were able to do excavation in a garden with the agreement of the landowner. 2 years later, this part of the site had already become a housing complex and settled in 2016. This is the situation we faced during our program, which started in 2011. In fact, this program became a kind of rescue excavation because we were competing with developers who were buying the land not every day, but we saw this announcement that part of the site would be constructed or the land was for sale for housing project. And when the decision is made to build a house or housing project, the archaeologists can do nothing, so we were not allowed to do any excavation. So at the end of the project, we had almost nowhere to dig anymore. Yeah? So another problem was water. We again, different context. We are here very close to the sea level, and so near the mangrove, and you can see that at least in the northern part of the site, we had to use the water pumps during the excavation. So in a way, it's a problem to do excavation, but you will see that this kind of preservation brings also a lot of advantage, because we can get some artifacts or ecofacts we cannot get in other sites. So we managed to do with water, and we knew that under the water there were some interesting finds. So I would like to mention also that as in Sipamutung, we had students from UI invited to excavate with us, and in Medan, as the site is in the suburbs of Medan, we also had the help of students from universities from Unimed and also from USU. Sometimes a lot of them. I remember once we had about 50 students on the field, and I remember they were not well prepared to follow this kind of excavation in the water with smartphone falling in the water and things like that. Yeah? So what kind of finds in this site? So as in Sipamutung, we found some brick remains, so brick walls. We knew already from the excavation conducted in the 70s that Kota Cina had some probably temple remains, and we were able to find new remains here, very much destroyed, only the base of the monument. And in fact, in the excavation, we didn't find any indication about the function of this building. So this, you can see the brick wall here, again working in the water. Another typical find in Kota Cina is shell middens. You can see here a thick layer of shells, which are the product of cooking by the people at the time, and it becomes an accumulation of shell. And this one is one of the thickest, about 60 centimeters thick. And usually this kind of accumulation is a proof of a settlement nearby, of a house nearby. And also it's usually very rich in many kinds of artifacts. Another type of finds, like in Sipamutung, we were able to find post holes. So the post, the wood had disappeared, but the post was still there. But in Kota Cina, as I mentioned earlier, because of the water, organic finds were rather well preserved. So we were able to find wood. Wood scatter, you can see here at the bottom of the excavation. And one example is probably this plank is part of a boat timber. Also, faunal remains. We had about 150 kilograms of faunal remains. So mostly bones, but also teeth. And this one is interesting. It's remains of turtle, and in fact, it's the species is a green turtle, and it is the dominant faunal remain in our site, which was rather surprising at the end of the project. So we are mapping this find. Another type of organic find is what is called ijuk in North Sumatra. This is the fiber of sugar palm, and at the time used to make cords and rope. So we were able to find dozens of such cord and ropes, sometimes still tied on the wood. So this is quite exceptional. I know that such type of wood and faunal remains and ijuk are found also on other coastal sites in the south of Sumatra, but it's rather rare and exceptional. Yeah? So again, we were able to dig even competing with the house developer and the water. We were able to dig almost 70 trenches from 2011 until 2016. And one field we developed was a paleo-environmental study because of the water, because of the preservation of this organic remain, the potential was there to try to reconstruct the landscape at the time of the occupation. So we invited the students from France to work on this question, and he succeeded, because at the beginning it was a big question mark. Will it be possible to do something or not? And he managed to do his PhD on this topic, and it is, so the result will be published probably next year with the collective volume produced at the end of the project. But he succeeded in first to look at the history of the sedimentation of the site, not only by looking at the site itself, but also at the whole valley, which is the Delhi River Valley, and the Delhi River has its source at the foot of the Sinabung mountain. Maybe you have heard about this Gunung Sinabung, because Sinabung is in eruption since about 10 years. So the Delhi River is at the foot of the Sinabung volcano. And so you can imagine a lot of sedimentation has been going on. So this was one part of the project, to look at the history of the sedimentation, but also to use a kind of remains which are called phytolith, which in fact are fossils of vegetables, which can be found in the sediments, and through it's similar to palynology, but it's another kind of organic remain. And through the study of this phytolith, he was able to suggest the landscape at the time, so about 12th, 13th century. So you will see the result of this study in our volume. So this kind of paleo-environmental study. We tried to do a similar thing in Sipamutung, but the result was more limited. We didn't do it in Barus, but this is a kind of innovative field for Indonesia. I think it's interesting to try to bring this new aspect. So you can see again earthenware shard, 164,000 shard, 1 ton 50. So as far as I know, this is probably the largest assemblage of earthenware for a terrestrial site in Sumatra. Same for stoneware. If you remember, in Barus we had 40,000 shards. Here in Kota Cina we have more than 50,000 shards. Again, probably the largest assemblage of stoneware and porcelain shard in Sumatra. Fauna remains very huge. Corpus, probably one of the largest, not only for Indonesia but also for Southeast Asia for this period. 150 kilograms, and again I knew that the site was rich in fauna remains, and I invited a specialist from France, archaeozoologist, to do a comprehensive study of these finds, and so identification of the species, but also work on the traces of cutting on this remains. So we have remains of fish, remains of various kind of mammals, sharks and tiger, and also crocodiles. So a large variety of find, which is also a way to understand the alimentation of the people at the time, and it's rather rare to be able to do this in Indonesia so far. Also a very important assemblage, Chinese coin. You can see 1,000 coins. In the 70s, Edward Mackinnon was also able to collect about 1,000 Chinese coins. So Kota Cina is very rich in Chinese coin. Again, there will be a specific study on this in the book. Something much rarer is the discovery of Sri Lanka coins. Sri Lanka coins were found also in Kota Cina in the 70s, but we found some of them, 4 of them, in the excavation. This one, this is here. So this one was found on the ground. They are dated to the 13th century. Metal fragments, so also large corpus, 500, glassware, again, but not a very large assemblage compared to Sipamutung. So you can see the difference. We are on the coast, we have about 1,000 shards of glassware. At Sipamutung, we were in the middle of the island, 4,000 shards for a contemporary site. Which means that for me, as regards the glassware itself, by the end of the 11th century, something happened for the supply of glassware in this part of Indonesia. Probably some supply chain from the Middle East were cut, and it's clear that after the 11th century, the supply of glassware coming from the Indian Ocean is coming down. Glass and stone bean, and as I mentioned, sugar palm fiber fragment, and also various pieces of wood, wedges and dowels, and talking about wood, I shall also mention that in the 80s, remains of shipwrecks were found in Kota Cina also. Unfortunately, they were found by people digging for sand, And when the archaeologists arrived to study the shipwreck, it was already destroyed. But at least they managed to study a few pieces of wood, and we know now that the technology used to make this boat, and they are contemporary to the site. This site of Kota Cina is dated between the end of the 11th century until the beginning of the 14th century. This dating was already suggested by Edward Mackinnon in the 70s and after. So we can confirm this. What the new contribution of this project is that we were able to do excavation almost all over the site, which is, you can see, about 25 hectares. So the 69 trenches are distributed where we were able to do the digging all over the site. In the 70s, Edward Mackinnon did excavation in one area only. So we will have a more comprehensive view of the site, and with this, maybe a better understanding of the history of the site. You can see here examples of Chinese ceramics, here example of earthenware, probably produced in South Asia, India or Sri Lanka, or at least inspired by earthenware made in South Asia. So this kind of wedges here, made of wood, a well-preserved knife of iron, and Chinese coin, and an example of glassware, a bottom of probably a small jar of a bottle. So, I think, yeah, that's all. Thank you. So, if you have a question, you can question me in Bahasa Indonesia or English or French, no problem. You have, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your very interesting explanation, the result of your exploration. My name is Andi from State Islamic University, Syarif Hidayatullah, Jakarta, Ciputat. My question is that about the introduction of Islam to this Malay world. You mentioned that only 6 evidence, the earliest one, number 1 in Brunei. I don't know yet which one you meant. But also we know in Lerang, East Java, which is dated around 1082, depending on the reading of this manuscript, the tombstone, because the sin in Arabic is not yet readable. Could be tis'in or sitin. Once it tis'in, that means that 90, or 16, that means 60. But the difference is only 30 years. Yeah. But once you say 1082, it becomes 11th century. But if 1122, it becomes 12th century. The reason is that very important for Muslim scholars here in Indonesia to prove that Islam actually came quite earlier than the result, the Western, let's say, excavation or historical facts. So my question is, that any evidence that you have found so far about the earliest evidence or proof of Islamization, or the coming or the introduction of Islam to this Malay world? Because Marasilu, for example, in Samudra Pasai or Malikus Saleh, dated 1297. So you found only 1350.
Yeah.
So this is all the questions around here. because Muslim like Hamka, like Hashimi, Tawfiq Abdullah, etc., they all believe that Islam actually came as earlier as 7th century after death of Jesus Christ. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. This is a huge topic for the first question. I would like to answer first. You mentioned Leran. Yes, we know about this gravestone, but my colleague Ludwig Kalus did a study of this gravestone a few years ago, already published, and it appears that this gravestone in fact has no connection with the history of Indonesia. For him, it was used as an anchor on a ship coming from the Middle East to Indonesia, but it is not related to the history of the country. So this is an interesting topic because there is a similar problem for an Armenian tombstone, if I remember, found somewhere in the South China Sea. Also, the same question. People found an Armenian tombstone dated maybe 14th or 15th century, but this tombstone is not related to the local history. It belongs to the high sea trade, and researchers were able to trace back this Armenian guy to a place in India. So nothing to see with the region. And so, according to my colleague Ludwig Kalus, for Leran it's the same. There is a gravestone. I think, if I remember, he agrees with the date, the millésime on the inscription, but you cannot use it for the history of coming of Islam in Java. Not this, because it was not used as a gravestone, it was used as an anchor. This is his hypothesis. Regarding Barus itself, I think we have to make a difference between the coming of Muslim traders and Islamization of a place. In Barus, especially with excavation in the Lobutua site, which was occupied from the end of the 9th century until the 11th century, we are pretty sure that Muslims were there almost from the beginning, so from the 9th century. But it doesn't mean it's okay. Muslim traders were there, but we cannot prove that Islamization was going on already. And in fact, Lobutua, so the older site compared to Bukit Hasang, which I presented today, Lobutua looks very much more like a foreign enclave or foreign trading post in this part of Sumatra than a local settlement. Huh? It's different with Bukit Hasang. Bukit Hasang, we have this numerous tombstone, which mean people were living there and were buried there. In Lobutua, we don't have such kind of proof of permanent occupation. People from India, maybe from the Middle East, they came to Barus to. In fact, the system was mainly like this regarding Indian traders. From India, they brought textile to Barus. In Barus, these textiles were exchanged for camphor and gold. This camphor and gold they brought this camphor and gold to Java. In Java, they exchanged camphor and gold against spices, and they brought the spices back to India and other places. So this is the the system with how Barus was involved in this high seas trade. So we can imagine that probably Lobutua was this kind of trading post with people living there, not permanently, coming at certain seasons to get camphor and gold and going to Java. Bukit Hasang, different, looks more stabilized with a more mixed population. So regarding Islamization, I think archaeologists will never find a proof of Islamization except if we find an inscription telling, like you mentioned, the Malik al-Saleh inscription, for example. But this kind of inscription is very rare. And I should mention, regarding Malik al-Saleh, that everybody knows about the inscription, but what should be mentioned also is that the grave is not contemporary to the inscription. So we have a 13th century inscription, but the gravestone is probably 15th century. It's not the original gravestone. So everybody agrees that this inscription is true, no problem, because it can be connected with the Ikayat Rajapase. But we have to be aware that there is something, the medium is not the original one. So what I can say as a result of our archaeological research, we have finds from the Middle East in our excavation. So there are also Middle Eastern sources mentioning the name of Barus, so there is no problem to say that Muslim traders were in Barus in the 9th century. Now for Islamization, I cannot answer that because well, we don't have a political inscription like in Pasay. You know, Pasay, you have the Sultan there. In fact, in Barus we have an inscription with a Sultan, but we don't know which Sultan is it. We have a genealogy, but we cannot connect this Sultan with any Sultan anywhere else in Sumatra. But it's later. So I cannot answer more than that we need to make the difference between presence of Muslims in one area and Islamization. And I think you're right, you mentioned Muslims in Sumatra since the 7th century, and if I remember, in Srivijaya, there is a Chinese sources mentioning the arrival of Muslims from Canton or something like that in the 7th century. So this is quite possible. But the problem or the process of Islamization it's something almost impossible to detect in the excavation. So we must realize that archaeology doesn't answer all the questions. What we find is just remains of material culture. It's not all the remains because we have a lot of material culture is using vegetable also, and it has disappeared. Except in Kota Cina, we have some remains of fibers and wood, but in other places, all these things have disappeared. So it's we have a limited view of the way of life, but it's better than nothing. Yeah.
Allow me to ask you two very quick questions. One, you explained the map and the settlement, and actually it reminds me of Siak in Riau and Tonle Sap, culture around Tonle Sap in in Khmer. So, especially in relation with Padang Lawas sites, can you explain more about the relation between settlement and water? And can we see that the settlement also relies heavily on the delta area or delta-based culture? That's one. The second is just on the, you mentioned a little bit about craving. Can you add more your explanation on the craving, be it in the home or in elsewhere or any others? Just want to know if you find this craving is very, very obvious as a way for you to look for the period. Oh yeah, my name is Henry from 1001 Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you. So, first question regarding relation between the settlement site of Sipamutung and river. In fact, what is important to mention is that gold was probably the main reason of the opening of a settlement in this area. There are traces of gold mining in the area, and a geomorphological study done by a colleague from France revealed that in the Baromon River was very much the potential to have gold was very high. So you can imagine that 1,000 years ago the potential was higher than now. So by and also the geomorphological study also revealed that the river was probably closer to the site at the time. So this is another factor. So gold, the river closer to the site, also the relation between Padang Lawas and other places in the Bukit Barisan where forest products and mineral, gold and probably silver also was exploited. I think all these factors lead to think that Sipamutung in the middle of the island was a kind of entrepot, trading place, but a kind of intermediary trading place for, and that all the products were brought down to the coast, to the Baromon River mouth, where there should be a settlement, but which has not been found so far. So there is a big question mark. I am almost sure it will be logical to have a settlement at the mouth of the Baromon River, but so far there is nothing. It doesn't mean we didn't find it, but it's maybe under 2 meters of sediment or washed away because of erosion, or I don't know. But so with our excavation, so first we prove the existence of a settlement there, and by looking at the economical environment, all the natural resources, it's possible to integrate this settlement in the middle of the island with the IC trade. And I think that Sipamutung was probably founded by people living in Kedah at the time, so in peninsular Malaysia, coming to the mouth of the Baromon River, and probably after some times going up the Baromon River, founding this Sipamutung site, and afterwards they met with Javanese people living on the other side of the Barisan Range, near because there is a Javanese temple, a whole Javanese temple there at Simangambat, near Penyabungan, if you know the area. So I think these Javanese people were attracted by Sipamutung, mixed with people coming probably from Kedah, to develop this site and all the temples of Sipamutung. Because what you see, this complex, this religious complex of Sipamutung, for me, it's only the last phase of the religious history of Sipamutung. Through our excavation, through survey using a ground penetrating radar, if we extrapolate the result of this find, I'm almost sure that there were many more buildings in this site, so which have disappeared for various reasons. But what we see now is just the last phase of this religious history. And again, for me, what is important with this excavation was to prove the existence of the settlement and how it is possible to integrate these settlements in the economic history of the region. For your second question was, you mentioned graving? Engraving or on which?
You show in your explanation not only on the tombstone but also some artifacts of graving. So can you explain? Yes.
Maybe I can come back to. Well. This one? Yeah, you have example of, you mean inscription, yeah? This inscription is interesting because it's a bilingual inscription written in Sanskrit and in Malay. If I remember well, there is a date, 11th century, if I remember well. So you see, it's at the back of a group of 3 images, and there is a date, and it's interesting because it also mentions the name of the individual who did the bronze images. The name is Surya. It's very rare to have the name of the craftsman who did this kind of images. So we have this kind of inscription on sculpture, but we have also funerary inscription, not exactly in Padang Lawas, but on the other side of Bukit Barisan, on the Merapi volcano. I cannot go into much detail about this. You can find all the detail of the inscription on the 2nd volume of the book on Padang Lawas. Yeah?
Okay. I'm sorry, we have to conclude now. Mr. Daniel Perret, do you have a word to conclude?
There is another last question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's ready, President.
Yeah.
Hello, Daniel.
Yeah.
I am Heddy Surachman from Indonesian Institute of Sciences, LIPI. Friend Professor Mulir Saras and Henri, with Timur. C'est très intéressant d'écouter votre lecture sur le site archéologie à Barus-Bukit Hasang, où apparition with histoire et culture du monde. Pour moi, c'est très important parce que c'est très riche de l'histoire pour Indonésia. Mon question est pour la futuriste. Est-ce que vous avez plan pour visiter l'autre site archéologique, par exemple au Kalimantan? Parce que c'est très intéressant pour regarder l'artefact de la route de Silk, par exemple. Deuxième question, comment je peux avoir votre bouquin? Parce que c'est très intéressant. Hein? Ici, c'est très difficile pour chercher votre bouquin. Merci.
Okay, I will answer in English. So my plan for the future, well, I am not a spring chicken anymore, and I am already planning a retirement. So I have a new project in Sarawak now. I have been working on North Sumatra for 30 years. So starting with history of the northeastern part of Sumatra, this area, looking at the way the Dutch, in fact, created ethnicity in this area. After that, so I moved to archaeology. After 30 years, I think it's okay now. I need new challenges, and maybe it's also important. You can see that the excavation are very limited. We, like almost every archaeological site, we only dig a few percent of the whole site, and in a way, it's good because we leave the opportunity for further generation to bring new methods and new ideas to look at the site. So I think especially in Barus, for example, I didn't show the Lobutua site, but today, so we went there with Heddy a few months ago. The Lobutua site is still there, still intact. So that means there is still opportunity for to do something. But I think it will be in 1 or 2 generations when there is new method of archaeological study. But my vision is that maybe in 50 years, digging will be done exceptionally. People will be using a sensor put inside the ground, into the ground, and with this big data method now, I am almost convinced that maybe not in 1 generation, but in 50 years from now, maybe digging will be no more used, or at least exceptionally for exceptional finds. So it's good to leave part of the site for further generation. Well, the problem is for a site like Kota Cina, you have seen, which now is almost completely occupied by a new layer of modern occupation. The site is still there, but it's below the modern occupation. But again, if there is a new method of archaeological study using other methods than digging, why not to try in the future? Yeah? If you compare, for example, the progress made in medical imagery, from X-ray to CT scan and all this digital imagery now, you can imagine that such progress will also be accomplished for archaeological methods. So I wouldn't be surprised to see archaeologists maybe in 50 years' time not digging anymore, but using a special sensor in the ground to locate, to identify all these things. Yeah. So to conclude about you mean about this my experience in North Sumatra. Well, it's very difficult to conclude this. I just first would like to thank my colleague from the Pusat Arkenas, because without them I wouldn't have been able to do all this project. It was a real chance because again, when I did my PhD, I mentioned all these sites in my PhD, but I never imagined that I would be able to do some study for each of them. to conclude, I would say that after this 25 years of cooperation, French-Indonesian cooperation in North Sumatra now is probably the best documented part of Indonesia for settlements for this period, let's say between the 9th and 13th century, or maybe for 14th century. Because we did extensive excavation, we got a lot of artifacts through multidisciplinary study. We got a lot of contribution. So I think maybe except a study done on Trawulan, which is, let's say, one complex site, I don't know of any other region in Indonesia where we have such a wealth of documentation for historical sites of this period. So I would encourage to do such things for other provinces in Indonesia to try to, for example, in Java, I don't know, but to bring new insight on the history of the region. I know that there are some very interesting sites in South Sumatra, and colleagues from the Pusat Arkanas are working on there. I hope they will continue their work and publish the result available for the largest public as possible, because with such kind of study, I think will improve very much the knowledge about history of Indonesia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Daniel Perret. Thank you all for coming. It was the last conference of this year's cycle. We hope to see you again soon. I would like to thank Edmond Junior from IRG for coming today and for his support on those cycles. And thank you to FAO for co-organizing these events. So now you can go and enjoy some refreshments in the lobby. Thank you all for coming.